In this video, I'll be covering an economic concept known as the Malthusian Trap and laying out some solutions to it. I will begin by explaining why the Malthusian Trap is important, then going into depth about what it is, and finally introducing the solutions. The Malthusian Trap is named after a 19th century clergyman named Thomas Malthus, and although its name sounds like mousetrap or the Venus flytrap, it really has nothing to do with any actual physical trap. Instead, it refers to the idea that because population grows faster than the food supply, there is a cap on the population and a cap on how much food will be available per person. Before diving into the mechanics, though, it's important to understand why this is such an important issue economically. If there is a limit to how rich the average person can get, and that limit is determined by the amount of new people, then the apparent solution to everyone becoming richer would be to limit the amount of new people coming into the world. For almost all of human history, this would have been impossible, unless parents literally abandoned babies after birth, which most wouldn't do. But with the advent of contraception and the legalization of abortion, this apparent solution now seems to be in play. I've literally read the argument in one of my philosophy classes that contraception should be given to African nations as a charitable donation to help them improve economically. So this is a solution that is on the table for some people. I'm a faithful Catholic, as some of you may know, and as a faithful Catholic, I'm ardently opposed to both contraception and abortion. But whatever your views are on them, I hope to present in this video at least some alternate solutions to this quote-unquote population problem. I would also note that contraception and abortion as a solution to this problem lead to falling birth rates, which is not a viable long-term solution to prosperity. Another reason that the Malthusian Trap is potentially problematic for Christians is that it would seem to suggest that the efficient thing to do, having less children, is opposed to the good thing to do, be fruitful and multiply, from Genesis. Now, I have no definite proof of this, but I believe that everything good is efficient, and though attempting to go into that would be far beyond the scope of this video, I would at least like to show that in this case, the good and the economically efficient don't contrast. Let's now finally turn to the graph in front of us and begin exploring the mechanics of the Malthusian Trap. Both of these graphs are made by a professor of mine at university, just so I don't commit plagiarism by forgetting to mention that. On the x-axis, we see the number of workers, which is akin to population, and on the y-axis, we have product of labor, say the amount of bread produced, or the food supply, something like that. The topmost line corresponds to total product of labor, TPL, and is quite simply the total amount of bread produced. Simple enough. The solid line down below is marginal product of labor and is a representation of how quickly total product of labor is growing and whether it would grow or shrink with the addition of another worker. In other words, marginal product of labor is the amount of bread that would be produced if an extra worker was added. Finally, we have average product of labor, which is the dotted line and represents the average amount of bread per worker, or simply total product of labor divided by the number of workers. Next, you'll notice that there are three stages marked out on the graph. In stage 1, the solid line is higher than the dotted line, meaning that the marginal product of labor is higher than the average product of labor, implying that the next worker added produces more bread than the average already available per person. This, in turn, raises the average amount of bread per worker. Beginning in stage 2, you'll see the solid line and the dotted line intersect with the solid line going lower than the dotted line. This shows that while the marginal product is still positive, meaning that the next worker added is still contributing more bread than there was before, total, the amount of bread the next worker is contributing is less than the average each original worker already has, which in turn lessens the amount of bread per worker. In stage 3, you'll see the solid line begin to go in the negative and the line at the top begin to decrease. At this stage, each additional worker is now beginning to get in the way of the original workers and actually decreasing the amount of bread that would have been produced without that worker. Why does the solid line, the marginal product of labor, begin to decrease at all, you might ask? This is simply because you can only have so many workers before the amount of productivity available to be gotten out of a job site starts decreasing. Too many cooks in the kitchen, you might say. So to recap, in stage 1, the next additional worker increases the average amount of bread per worker. In stage 2, the next additional worker decreases the average amount of bread per worker while still producing more total bread. And in stage 3, the next additional worker decreases the average amount of bread per worker while harming the total bread supply. How does this all relate back to the Malthusian trap? Well, if the population, i.e., number of workers, increases faster than the rate at which new food can be produced, i.e., total amount of bread, then there will be a cap on the population, since too many people relative to the food supply would mean that the average product of labor, i.e., average bread per worker, would decrease below the limit needed for the population to survive either in stage 2 or stage 3, and a cap on the food supply since stage 2 will eventually give way to stage 3. Let's imagine a scenario to see how this might play out. First of all, suppose that we are in stage 2 or stage 3 in the graph, since the population grows at a faster rate than the food supply and will have already taken advantage of the gains to be made in stage 1. Then, suppose a random succession of good harvests occurs. This will increase the amount of bread per person, leading to higher fertility and lower mortality, leading to an increase in population. However, an increase in population will lead to a lower average product of labor since we are now in stage 2 or stage 3, we are already in stage 2 or stage 3, which leads to the amount of bread per worker decreasing. This will lead to a decrease in fertility and an increase in mortality, leading to a decrease in population, and we're right back where we started. This is all fine and good, you might say, but what about improvements in technology? After all, there are way more people living now than a century or two ago. Wouldn't it make sense that the population cap and food supply cap were circumvented by the great technological improvements made during that time? It turns out that a technological improvement alone doesn't get you out of the Malthusian trap. To see why, let's turn to the second graph. In this graph, you will see two curves, both of which represent the average product of labor. The black one for a less technologically developed economy, and the blue one for an economy with a certain technological improvement. You will also notice that the x-axis and the y-axis are almost identical to the previous graph. In fact, the only difference is that in the previous graph, the y-axis we supposed to be bread, while in this graph it says bread per farmer, which turns out to be the same. The orange line represents the minimum amount of bread needed to sustain an adult. Finally, BE is the maximum amount of farmers that can be sustained under the black curve's economy, since any more farmers would lower the amount of bread per farmer, while BH is the same for the blue curve's economy. To play out this scenario of a technological improvement, let's imagine that we suddenly get a technological improvement and the economy goes from the black curve to the blue curve. What changes? Well, the amount of bread per farmer goes from A to C, since there are still only BE amount of farmers. What happens next? Since the population grows under a positive shock to the food supply, the population will grow up to BH from BE, and the amount of bread per farmer will once again remain stuck at A, having gone down from C. So now we come to the crux of the video. How do you escape this Malthusian trap? There are two ways to escape the Malthusian trap. The first is by having a technological culture of innovation. It isn't enough to have one technological innovation, but rather multiple in succession are needed. But wait, you might say, didn't we just examine that and conclude that the amount of bread per farmer will remain stuck? Yes, but that was with only one technological change. It may be true that in the long run things will even out, but if another positive shock is administered to the system in the short run, that will again push the average product of labor curve up another notch before subsistence level is reached. This is the part that Malthus, the originator of this theory, missed, that it may take years for the Malthusian trap to fully close, and in the meantime the bird may escape. These technological changes don't necessarily need to be groundbreaking or all have to do with food either. For example, the advent of refrigeration has allowed masses of perishable food to be stored much longer than they otherwise would have, leading to less waste and more efficient distribution of food. Crop fertilizer is a pretty obvious technological change that has had a big impact, but another constraint on population growth is access to food with improvements in transportation, making a huge difference. Obviously, there needs to be enough extra food to transport in the first place, which is why technological change like crop fertilizers are precursors to this other sort of technological change working, but the both together can have a very powerful effect in helping to escape the Malthusian trap. Okay, so we've established that with the continued short-term positive shocks to the system, will drive the average productive labor curve up such that subsistence level doesn't get reached. But what if there isn't a culture of technological innovation, or what if technological innovation dries up, let's say for a few years? In that case, there's still three components which could help a country escape the Malthusian trap. These three are land, resources, and immigration outflow. Given all three of resources, land, and immigration outflow, a country can escape the Malthusian trap by utilizing the right combination of them. Now let's take the case of each pair of the three, case by case, and then the case of all three together. Resources and land together allows the increase in birth rate to be diffused outwards into the undeveloped land owned by the country in question, while the original population can take advantage of the extra resources sent back by those colonizing the undeveloped land. This is exactly how the United States escaped the Malthusian trap in the 19th and 20th centuries, except that they had so much undeveloped land and extra resources, they also required a lot of extra immigration inflow to help realize all of those gains. Resources and immigration outflow will solve the Malthusian trap, since the resources increase only the incomes of those in the original country and not those who are leaving it, again assuming culture and technological innovation. For this to happen, though, there has to be an incentive for people to leave the country as it's getting richer, either a carrot or a stick. This is actually how Britain escaped the Malthusian trap in the 18th and 19th century by migration to the USA, according to Finlay and O'Rourke. Quote, "Furthermore, even after independence, the United States remained an English-speaking country whose white inhabitants hailed mostly from the British Isles." End quote, page 352, Power and Plenty. In a paper I wrote for college, I go into more detail about how Britain and the United States each escaped the Malthusian trap and the differences between their two paths, but that is a little tangential to this discussion here. Land and immigration outflow will not necessarily help a country escape the Malthusian trap if the land in question doesn't have resources, since although a culture of technological innovation is assumed to be in place, if there aren't extra resources there to be sent back to the original population by the colonizers or resources to be taken advantage of in the original part of the country in question, there won't be anything there for the technology to utilize. A crude analogy is that if you have a machine that can turn straw into gold but no straw, it's not going to be of much use to you. The immigration outflow combined with the land won't even help in the short run, since the people leaving for the infertile land and the people leaving the country are both not contributing extra resources, at least in this simple model. In practice, however, a country with extra land is rarely going to have that extra land be completely barren of resources. This brings us to the last scenario of resources, land, and immigration outflow together. This will solve the Malthusian trap following the same logic as the land and immigration outflow scenario. More people are leaving the country than coming in, but because there's abundant resources and land, the birth rate will climb until the population takes advantage of the extra resources and land. In practice, however, this scenario probably won't happen because a place with extra resources and land would likely lead to an immigration inflow rather than an immigration outflow, and that may be why only 2 out of these 4 scenarios have been observed over the course of history. In conclusion, the Malthusian trap refers to a situation where the birth rate is checked at the amount of people able to survive at subsistence level due to population increasing faster than the food supply. This is represented graphically by the average productive labor curve intersecting the level of subsistence on the y-axis. There are several ways to escape the Malthusian trap. The first is by administering constant positive shocks to the average product of labor curve via a culture of technological innovation. Barring that, the two most consistent ways to escape are through a combination of resources and land, which is how the United States escaped, or a combination of resources and immigration outflow, which is how Britain escaped. Either way, the Malthusian trap can be broken, and God's injunction to be fruitful and multiply is as good and beneficial a law as it ever was.